we'll go ahead and get started. All right, well, welcome everyone to our next webinar in the Small Farms webinar series, hosted by the University of Illinois Extension Small Farms team. This is Nathan Johanning. I'm an extension educator in Southern Illinois, located in Murfreesboro, and we are happy to have you. So we do appreciate you joining us, and we are going to try to do our best to confine this between the noon and 1 o'clock hour. So with this, it's kind of a tight time frame for us to deliver this, we hope to be very good in-depth information this week on blackberries. And so we are going to limit your questions to just through the chat box. I will be trying to keep track of some of the questions, and Bronwyn will try to answer some as we go. However, I will log questions at basically later on at the end of the presentation, so that way we can make sure we get through the presentation in a timely manner. So this presentation is also recorded, and you will all receive a link to the archive presentation right after, shortly thereafter the conclusion of this, once we get things edited and up online. And if you have any difficulties, please again refer to the chat box for the information as far as getting your audio to work and things like that. So with that, I will go ahead and introduce our presenter, which is Mrs. Bronwyn Ailey. She is a fellow extension educator of mine. She is stationed in actually Saline County today in Harrisburg, and so she has a wealth of experience. She has a lot of research and grower experience. She spent many years working at the Dixon Springs Ag Center for the University of Illinois before she came to us in University of Illinois Extension. Her role at the Ag Center was doing research on fruit and vegetable crops, some of which included blackberries. So we are happy to have her today. And with that, Bronwyn, I will turn it over to you, and we can get on the way.
All right. Thank you, Nathan. I'd like to welcome everybody for the presentation on growing great blackberries. I told Andy when I gave him my topic for this webinar series, I said, well, I'll do blackberry production, and he decided that we would go with growing great blackberries. So we're going to grow great blackberries today. So as we go through today some topics that I want to cover, we're going to go through a little bit of Blackberry terminology, so everybody's on the same page as far as when I mention different terms throughout the presentation, you know what we're talking about. We'll also review site selection and preparation, different things to think about in establishing a planting. We'll talk about cultivar selection, cultural management practices, and also some pest management practices. So when we talk about Blackberry terminology, the first two terms we want to talk about are primocane and floricane. And we need to remember that blackberry canes last for 2 years and then they die. The cane that comes up and goes through its first year of growth, we refer to it as primocane. Primo meaning one or first year. When that cane goes through its second year of growth, then we refer to it as a floricane. So they are not two separate canes. It's the same cane with a different name in different times of its growth, either the first year or the second year. The majority of blackberry varieties produce fruit on their floricanes, but over the last few years there have been some new varieties that have been bred that are actually primocane fruiting varieties, and we'll talk more about those later. Some other terms to think about are thorny versus thornless, and that's intuitively either varieties that have thorns or do not have thorns. And then when we have terms like erect, semi-erect, and trailing, that's referring to the growth habit of the different cultivars. Generally, erect varieties do not require trellising, although we will see that there are benefits to trellising even on the cultivars that have a very upright or erect growth habit. Trellising is still going to provide some benefit. Semi-erect varieties, trellising is definitely beneficial and suggested. And then trailing varieties, trellising is going to be required because of their growth habit. And we will also, there is also kind of a gradient in some of the new varieties that are coming out, where they might be classified as erect, but their growth habit might lean more towards semi-erect. And so there's kind of a gradient in there now. Okay, when we talk
Hey,
about...
Bronwyn, move your
Yes.
microphone just a couple of inches away from your mouth. We're getting lots of pops on the P's.
Okay, how's
Thanks. Perfect.
that? Okay. Okay, on site selection,
Little too far, now you're quiet.
we'll get it just right.
There you go. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, how about now? All right. So when we think about site selection, you want to give careful consideration to where you're going to establish this planting, because once we get a planting in place and it's in its happy place, it's in a good location, that planting could last 10 or 12 years. So we want to make sure that we're putting a lot of thought into our site selection. We want to make sure that we know the cropping history of that site. Blackberries can be really susceptible to verticillium wilt, and so we do not want to put blackberries on ground that has been planted to strawberries or solanaceous crops like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, potatoes in the last 4 to 5 years, because those crops are also susceptible to verticillium wilt, and if we've had any problems with that in the past on those crops in that location, we don't want to introduce that into a new blackberry planting. So cropping history on that ground, on your location, is going to be really important. The other thing to think about is your water and air drainage. We want to make sure that we're in a site that is not going to be standing water. That water can run off of the area, so we would like to see a sloping area. And that slope is also going to provide good air drainage, because cold air runs a lot like water downhill. So if we can get the cold air to drop below our planting, then we can reduce our risk of frost injuries. We also need to think about our access to irrigation water. Blackberries do benefit from irrigation, especially during drought times, and so whether we're going to use municipal water or a well or a pond surface water, we need to make sure that our site does have access to some type of irrigation water. And then if you're thinking about maybe going into starting up a U-pick operation, what is the accessibility of your location, and is there parking nearby? So we need to think not just about production issues on our site selection, but also how we're going to market that crop, and if we're going to market it from that location, are we set up to do so? And also on site preparation, we need to make sure that we're beginning at least 1 year before planting. We're going to start with our soil test. And then once we get the soil test back, we're going to make any necessary amendments based on those test results. And usually those amendments are going to go in 6 to 12 months before our planting, so they've got time to work in. Also within this year, we're going to want to control any perennial weeds, and we also are going to want to make sure that we remove any wild brambles. And we need to make sure we're removing those maybe up to 1,000 feet away from our planting site, if that's possible, depending on your location. Wild brambles can transmit viruses and other diseases into your planting, and that you want to try to avoid. During your control of your perennial weeds, that can be spraying the location with a burn down like glyphosate, or possibly cultivating in and using cover crops. But all of these things need to be considered and be worked on a year before you're planting. And also, depending on your irrigation needs, if you need to dig a well, or if you have a pond or well already in place, use this time to get your water tested and make sure your water quality is where it needs to be for your irrigation, and any other system setup that needs to be done prior to planting. And we think about drainage, depending on your site, maybe you need to put some tiles in to help with drainage issues. Blackberries can also benefit from being up on raised beds, and so if that's something that you need to plan for and work into the site preparation, keep that in mind as well. And if you're going to be putting in trellising, which for the majority of these crops you will, or these varieties, you will need to put that in, some of the you could go ahead and set some of the posts at the ends and get those already established. And when we talk about soil amendments, we're going to want to apply any of our phosphorus, potassium, calcium, or magnesium, like I said, 6 to 12 months prior to planting. So that's got time to work in. When you take your soil test, we'd like to see that come back. If it comes back around 50 pounds per acre of potassium and between 200 and 300 pounds per acre of, 50 pounds per acre of phosphorus or 200 to 300 pounds per acre of potassium, that is the range we would like to be in for phosphorus and potassium, and so those wouldn't really need to be amended at that point. Good thing about blackberries is that they're pretty adaptive to different soils, and they don't require a lot of specific. They need a balance of the nutrients, but they're not as nutrient intolerant as say a blueberry crop. And also on the pH range for blackberries, they do well anywhere between 5.5 to 6.5, so just slightly acidic soils. Other soil amendments, if you are wanting to apply any manures, they need to be put down in the fall prior to planting and incorporated in. And as I mentioned earlier, cover crops can be planted and incorporated, and we could use those. You could plant summer crops and then also a fall crop prior to planting to help with weed control. Also could help add organic material to your soil. And also, I really don't know where I was going with that. Sorry there, guys. So anyway, cover crops for weed control and organic material. So when we think about establishing the field, ideally, in the ideal perfect world, we would have this great north-facing slope next to a lot of good traffic with an excellent water source, and everything would be perfect when we plant on a north-facing slope and it would allow for afternoon shade. Blackberries are pretty tough, and so if we can't find this ideal north-facing slope, we can still make these work. When we lay out our field, you want to arrange the varieties so that ripening proceeds in an orderly fashion across your field. And when you look at your site, and you want to work up your site, you're really planting, your blackberries are in the row that only needs to be about 3 feet wide. So if you are on a really good sloping location, you might not want to work that whole field up during the year prior, because then you're going to run into erosion problems and different things. If you had the ability to maybe just work your rows, that would be a good option. Your row middles, ultimately you'd like those to have some sort of sod cover so that you can keep your middles mowed. But also, depending on the equipment that you have available, working up a 3 foot wide strip every 10 to 12 feet might not be an option for you. So working your whole site will work, but just remember when you make your soil amendments and things, you really just need to amend that 3 foot wide stretch of ground. So when we're selecting plants, we want to make sure that we're purchasing from nurseries that offer certified virus-free plant material. And when we get plants, we can get them either as root cuttings or one-year-old bare root plants or tissue culture plants. The thorny varieties tend to grow out well from root cuttings, and those would be your least expensive plant purchases. But some of the new thornless varieties have a little bit of difficulty growing out from root cuttings, and so those need to be purchased as either bare root plants or tissue culture plants. The tissue culture plants are going to be the most costly plants to buy, but they are also grow a lot quicker in that first year. So I think you can reach production quicker with the tissue cultured plants. And those you can see the picture on the right. Tissue culture plants. This is a variety Washita that's going to be planted out on a field this spring. And on the picture on the left, those are bare root plants of, I believe, Chester. And so you can see how they come in differently. These bare root plants were basically a one-year-old cane, about as big around as a pencil. And those were tipped at the top, and you can see the lateral buds have started to come out in these pictures. So you do have some choices, but again, make sure that you find your plants, your plant source is growing and selling certified virus-free plant material. So we're wondering how many plants per acre would we need. That depends on the type of the varieties that you're planting and the spacing that you're going to utilize in your field. So this table was from growing blackberries in Missouri, Pat Byers' bulletin. And so if we look at, let's say we're going to do erect thornless varieties, and those are going to be at 4 feet apart in the row. Probably 8 feet between rows is a little tight. It just depends on the equipment that you've got. You need to think about how you're going to mow and spray these. So probably 10 to 12 feet between rows is going to be a more workable distance. And so you're looking at anywhere between 900 to 1,100 plants per acre approximately. So this gives you an idea of how many plants you might need to put out an acre planting. So when we get our plants, we want to, on the bare root or the root cut plantings, we're going to get those set in the ground in early spring, probably looking at third week of March or so. On tissue cultured plants, we're going to want to wait until after the last frost because those are young, tender plants, and we don't want those to be damaged by any late frost. When your plants come in, you want to make sure that you keep their roots moist and cool prior to planting. Sometimes, we get our plants shipped from the nursery at about the approximate time we need to be planting, but due to field conditions or other things that come about, we might not be able to get them in the ground within the first day or two of arriving. So we'll need to make sure that we're keeping those roots moist and cool until we can get them in the ground. They also benefit from soaking them in water for a few hours prior to planting. They're soaking the roots in water prior to planting for a few hours. Another thing to remember, if you are going to be using plastic mulch or weed mat, landscape fabric, make sure and remember that you've got your irrigation line put in underneath before you get these plants set, and you want to make sure you've got that in before you lay this fabric or mulch down, because I have done it and it's not pleasant to have to pull a trickle line through plastic. So it takes a while and it's very frustrating. So try to remember this step for sure. You want to make sure that you're going to water each plant in immediately after you set them. We don't want to wait. We want to make sure that they get good root soil contact in the row. You're also going to make sure that you've got your trellis system established. If you haven't already got your posts in place, you want to make sure you've got those in now, and get your trellis, get your line strung up. After we've got these in the ground, we want to make sure that we're controlling weeds and we're irrigating as needed. And through weed control in this stage, we can be pulling weeds, we can hoe, we can do a little bit of cultivation, but we need to remember that these blackberries will generally root down about 18 inches. And so when we've worked our ground, we want to make sure that we've got it worked up at least 2 feet deep in our plant rows, so that we allow our plants, the roots, to get down as deep as we can. We want to make sure we've broken up any hard pans. I know here in southern Illinois, sometimes the hard pan's 4 to 6 inches down and you've already hit it. So you want to make sure that you've got your soil worked up really deep. And so when we go back and we want to cultivate some weeds, or cultivate near these plants to help with weed control, we don't want to cultivate very deep, not more than about 1 inch down. So, maybe going through with a hoe very lightly over the top is easier. We also, generally when we are putting in a new planting of anything, we think, well, we need to add fertilizer. We are going to want to fertilize these in, but we want to wait about 4 to 8 weeks after planting to let those new roots get established and start growing. And at this time, right after planting, the 4 to 8 weeks after planting, we want to apply around 10 pounds to the acre of actual nitrogen, but not any more than that. And ammonium nitrate would be our fertilizer of choice, and I know that is, if you can still get it, I know it's really hard to find anymore. So I think that using urea or probably calcium nitrate would be fine. Just make sure that you're not going over that 10 pounds per acre of actual nitrogen. So do those calculations out depending on your fertilizer that you use. And now we talk about cultivar selection. Choosing different cultivars for our site, things we need to think about would be fruit size and quality. Flavor is really important, especially depending on your market. If you're selling at farmers markets and roadside stands, a lot of times the flavor can be a larger deciding factor in your cultivar that you choose over your yield or your fruit size. Your customer will kind of dictate those guidelines for you. Obviously we would like to find cultivars that are good yielding. Depending on your location, those in the northern half of Illinois, winter hardiness is definitely high on your list of things to look at on cultivars. And conversely, for those of us in southern Illinois and further south, heat tolerance is something for us to look at. And by heat tolerance, that comes into play especially on these new primocane fruiting varieties, as they are setting blooms late in July and August for us for a very late season crop. When temperatures get above 85, then that can cause flowers to abort and can cause a great reduction in yield potential. So heat tolerance on varieties can play an important role for those of us to the south. Firmness of the berry is important depending on your market, especially if you're looking at shipping or more of a wholesale market. And then also storage quality. And then seasonality. How long do you want to extend your blackberry season? And we can control that. One of the ways that we can extend that is by finding varieties that ripen throughout the season, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get through the rest of the cultivars. And so the next few slides, I've got listed cultivar selections by type, and by type I mean their growth habitat and whether they're thorny or thornless. And these varieties are listed in order of their ripening from earliest to latest. And when I'm going to give you some rough dates on approximately when they ripen, and this would be based off of yield data collected and variety evaluations done from University of Arkansas in Clarksville, Arkansas. And for those who, like myself, that were not familiar with exactly where Clarksville, Arkansas is located, it is a little bit north and west of Little Rock, and so it is in plant hardiness zone 7B. And where I sit here in southern Illinois, I am in 7A, and so when I looked at some of these ripening dates, they're about a week earlier than I am. And so when I give you these dates, kind of keep in mind that this is for varieties that are ripening in hardiness zone 7B. Usually in southern Illinois, we're about 4 weeks ahead of the northwest tip of Illinois, which is in zone 5A. So there's about a 4-week difference between us north to south, and so some of these dates are yet another week further or earlier than what I would be in southern Illinois. So anyway, on cultivar selections for erect thorny, the earliest ripening variety would be Choctaw, and in Arkansas, this was found to they could start harvesting around May 30th, and so that is really early. It's a medium-sized fruit, pretty soft fruit, and the yields have been variable on it. I think what folks really like about this variety is how early it is. It allows you to get into the market a lot sooner than other varieties. And then next on the ripening would be Shawnee, and again this has high yields, but with soft fruit. And then the variety Chickasaw was introduced, and it ripens at around the same time as Shawnee, but its offering, which is around approximately June 8th, again in Clarksville. But the benefit to Chickasaw is that it provides firm fruit, so it could be depending on your market, could be a good replacement for Shawnee because they are both ripening at about the same time. Then the next variety we have is Kiowa. It has large fruit, and it has a really long harvest period of about 6 weeks. And it's generally ripening in Arkansas, in Clarksville, at around June the 12th. So a few days later than Chickasaw, and almost 2 weeks later than Choctaw. I have had a couple of growers tell me that they really liked the flavor of the Kiowa, but also that when you say thorny, it is really thorny. In fact, I think one grower suggested maybe using some chainmail during harvest. So then the last erect thorny variety I wanted to mention was Illini Hardy. This is a medium fruit. Benefit to Illini Hardy, it has really good winter hardiness, and so for those growers in the more northern climates, this would probably be a good choice. One thing to think about when you're doing your variety selections, how are you planning to market your berries? If you're going to have a U-pick operation, are your customers going to like picking off of thorny blackberries? And another thing to consider is what are the liability issues if somebody's gets scratched up picking blackberries, and then gets infected, and now are you going to be liable? So those are things to think about. I think in general, people have felt that the flavor on thorny blackberry varieties is better than the thornless, and so that's why we still see these varieties in production. But I think as new varieties are coming out, especially from the University of Arkansas breeding program, the flavor profiles are getting a lot better and changing. So we'll switch from the erect thorny, and then we'll talk about the erect thornless varieties. And some of these, a couple, especially Natchez and Washita, even though they're considered erect, these would be a couple of those varieties that I think they're on that kind of sliding scale that I would tend to push more towards probably the semi-erect growth habit as opposed to the true, more very upright erect habit. So Natchez is a very early, is probably the earliest on the thornless varieties. It has very large elongated fruit, and it probably yields about twice as much as Arapahoe. And Arapahoe also ripens at around the same time as Natchez, which is around June the 5th in Arkansas. The Arapahoe, the fruit size is smaller and the yields are more average compared to the Natchez. And the picture on this slide is actually a picture of Natchez that we grew at Dixon Springs, probably in 2008, 2009. These are very large, elongated fruit. We actually kind of nicknamed them the Marge Simpson fruit because they reminded us of the hair, of Marge Simpson's hair off of the Simpsons show. So the newest variety, thornless erect variety released from Arkansas is Osage, and it has very high yields and an excellent storage quality, excellent storage properties. And Osage is going to come in around June the 7th, so just a couple of days after Natchez. And then you have Washita showing excellent yields, medium-sized, firm fruit, so good shelf life storage on Washita. And it's going to ripen about 5 days after Natchez, around June the 10th. And then you have Navajo, which is a very firm berry. I don't think the yields are as high as some of the others. It's a little bit older variety, but it is very firm. And then the last one would be Apache, which is going to ripen around June the 20th. Apache has had high yields, but it does have a problem with white drupelets, so that's something to keep in mind on the erect thornless. And so now when we talk about what has been classified as the semi-erect thornless, and again, I feel like Natchez and Washita could probably slide into this category, but the three we'll talk about here are Triple Crown. This has a large fruit, very, very winter hardy. As compared to Chester, which is also winter hardy and large fruit, Chester's going to yield a little bit better than Triple Crown, although Triple Crown comes in a little bit earlier than Chester. And then the other semi-erect thornless would be the whole thornless. This is a really, really sweet berry. I think it's been noted for its very sweet flavor, but probably recommending this for home gardeners only. I don't think that the yield is there, and it wouldn't really be recommended on a commercial scale. So then just briefly, because we did mention trailing habit of some blackberries, a couple of varieties, Boysen and Marion, but trailing type blackberry cultivars are not recommended for commercial production just because they have a real lack of winter hardiness, and so we won't really go into any more discussion or talk about trailing varieties anymore, but I did just want to mention that there are a couple of out there. And so I talked about earlier, we have due to some new breeding lines out of the University of Arkansas, we do have varieties now that are fruiting on primocane, on the primocanes. And when the first varieties that he introduced have been thorny, and the first ones that came out were Prime Jim and Prime Jan, and those have probably been out at least 10 years or more now. But we've found, even though these these have the potential to be pretty high yielding. They both have really soft fruit and are not recommended for commercial growers. Definitely great for the homeowner for sure. And then another thorny variety that has come out of this breeding line, Primark 45. This one has excellent post-harvest handling. And the primocanes on this variety have a late ripening window. And so this variety could be good for those in a little bit more northern climate. I'm sorry, for those more in a southern climate, because of that late ripening. If you were in the more northern climate, a late frost could hurt your yields on the primocanes. But this late ripening of the primocanes works better for those of us in the south because it's got better heat tolerance than what we saw with Prime Gem and Prime Jan. That was another problem on the commercial scale, was that when those two varieties were flowering and ripening in that primocane season, it was flowering in a time when it was still too hot. It was 85 or above, and we were having a lot of flower aborting and saw a loss in yields. And so Primark 45, by ripening later, we might be on a little bit cooler weather pattern and not have as many 85-degree days to hurt the flowers. And then with these primocane fruiting varieties, they will set a crop on the primocane in the fall of the year. And then once that crop is over, you can tip those canes back below where those fruits were, and the following year they will also have a floricane crop on them. And so you're actually able to double crop on the same cane with these varieties. On the floricane, when these floricanes ripen on the Primark, they're going to ripen somewhere between the Natchez and Ouachita times. And so the ability to have a double crop has been pretty exciting for commercial growers. But everybody was asking, what about a thornless? The previous ones had all been thorny, and so there have been a couple of very new releases that have come out of University of Arkansas, Primark Freedom and Primark Traveler. And these are really new releases, and so definitely would only recommend these for trialing on your location just to see how they perform where you're at. And I guess that disclaimer should go for all of these varieties, actually. When you're choosing varieties, I wouldn't suggest going and buying 1,000 plants of one variety that you've never tested in a small area on your farm, because all of these varieties could perform differently in different locations. And so you need to try a few out and see which ones are going to work well for you, and then increase your planting from there. On the Primark Freedom, this was the first thornless release. It's probably the earliest ripening, but the fruit is soft, and so it's not going to be good for shipping. On the Primark Traveler, the primocane crop is going to ripen about 2 weeks earlier than the Primark 45, and so the Primark Traveler may be good for the more northern areas where your primocane crop is hurt by the early frost. And then conversely, the floricane crop is actually ripening early with Natchez. These are kind of exciting new varieties coming out from Dr. Clark at the University of Arkansas, and something to definitely keep our eye on. So when we talk about cultural management, pollination, fertilization, irrigation, pruning, training, and trellising. On the pollination, honeybees and other native pollinators are all going to work the blackberries. if there's a question on cross-pollination, most of the varieties are considered self-fruiting, and so you wouldn't necessarily have to have another variety for cross-pollination, although I think they would all benefit from it. And more than likely, in a planting, you're not going to have a planting with a single variety all the way across. You're going to have multiple varieties out there anyway, so you will see cross-pollination occurring. On the fertilization, again, the amendments of PK, calcium, and magnesium should be made prior to your planting based on your soil tests. And on most sites, nitrogen is probably the only nutrient that you're actually going to apply annually. And again, ideally we'd like to use ammonium nitrate, but other sources can be used as well. And an estimated amount of nitrogen required for 1-year-old plants between 25 and 30 pounds per acre. 2-year-old plants, it's going to increase to between 35 and 45 pounds per acre. And then 3-year-old plants and older, we're up to about 45 to 55 pounds per acre. And those ranges, that can depend on your soil type and also whether you're irrigating in. So if you're on a sandy location with irrigation, you're probably going to be on the higher end of this range. And if you're on a more clay soil, you would probably be on the lower end of the range. But we also need to remember, these are just estimates, and look at your planting and see how it's responding to your nitrogen applications. You'd like your leaves to be a really dark green color, and so if they're not that super dark, almost black green, then maybe you need to add a little bit more nitrogen in. Conversely, if the varieties across the board are responding in a very vigorous, lots of extra growth, maybe that's a sign we need to cut the fertilizer back just a little bit. We want to make sure we're applying our nitrogen about half in early spring, before any growth starts, and then the remaining half is going to be in May, and so that would be, at the time of flowering to maybe green, just the start of green fruit. On irrigation, blackberries are definitely going to benefit. It's really important during planting establishment, fruit development, and also during cane development. If we're not going to have sufficient rainfall, we want to make sure that we're going to be able to irrigate to meet the water requirements of our blackberries. And on average, about an inch to an inch and a half of water per week from bloom to harvest. You can use drip irrigation or even orchard tubing with emitters at each plant works well. And you're going to need this to help maintain your plant vigor, especially during times of drought. Now, when we talk about pruning, primocanes are going to be tipped when they reach 36 to 48 inches in length, and that's going to be in early summer. When we tip, that's going to encourage lateral branch growth. We need to remember also when we're pruning to take out any suckers that are outside of the planting row. We want to keep that planting row as narrow as possible. In my mind, if suckers are outside the planting row, then now they're considered a weed and they need to be removed. When you do your dormant or early spring pruning, we're gonna prune our laterals back to 12 to 14 inches. And this is going to help increase our fruit size and also help ease in harvesting. And also during dormant or early spring pruning, we're going to remove any disease or infected canes. And I use the word infected because we might also have some insect problems that could infect the canes, and we'll see a picture of that later. But any canes that have been damaged through maybe from wind or animal depredation, we need to remove those as well. And then after harvest, we're going to want to remove those spent floricanes because they're dead and they're of no use to the plant anymore. It's also a lot easier to remove them after harvest because it's very easy to tell the difference between the dead floricane and the live primocane at that time of the year. Sometimes if you wait until late winter, it could be hard to tell the difference between the two. So it's a lot, if you've got the time, try to do it after harvest. There's a couple of diagrams. On the top diagram, it talks about pinching the tips off, and those are going to be really, at that point the cane is very tender, and so you can actually tip with just using your finger. You might, if it's a thorny variety, you might have gloves on, but you can go out and just tip, and that's, breaking off the top 2 or 3 inches. And then when we see, as we go into the dormant season, we would want to remove any of the floricanes that had fruited last year if we haven't already done that. And we also would take this time to thin out. If we have a lot of extra primocanes still there, we could thin some of those out. We'd like to have, depending on whether you're growing, utilizing erect thorny or semi-erect thornless, that spacing can change anywhere from 4 to 6 or 3 to 5 canes at a time is good. So anything that's thin or damaged, take that out as well. And then you can also see that we're going to shorten up the laterals off of the sides. And that's where we talked about shortening those up to about 12 to 14 inches each. And then the bottom picture, again, what it looks like before we do dormant prune, and then after. You can see we've shortened our laterals up, and we've taken out thinned out a few of the thinner canes at the bottom and left like 4 really good strong canes.
Hey, Bronwyn,
Yes.
just a quick question, if you would just give a brief identifier during the mid-season, how they can identify the floricanes and primocanes. Just a few notes on that here.
In the mid-season.
In mid-season and also in the fall, whenever you're
Okay.
doing, just a couple brief comments, if you would.
Okay, so the floricane removal after harvest on. Okay, so when we're talking about not the primocane fruiting, but on the floricane fruiting varieties, after harvest, so the second season on that cane, the floricane, you've harvested your fruit. It will be pretty obvious that the new primocanes will be growing up also along with that, so they will tend to be a little bit more pliable. Probably not as many lateral branches as you would see on your floricanes. I'm kind of struggling because it would be we walk out and you just know which ones you've harvested off of and you remove those. In the winter, in the dormant time, if you have not removed those are going to be very gray and dead-looking wood, versus the overwintering primocanes will be more reddish color. Does that help answer the question?
I think that gives some good parameters for identification. So we will continue on here with the remaining about 11 minutes or so we have. So.
All right, talk fast. On the training and trellising, we're going to look at, you have a single wire system, which can be used for erect, thorny, and thornless varieties, a 2-wire T or V trellis system, and using this with some of the newer erect, semi-erect, thornless varieties. And then there's also another new trellising system that's been developed by the USDA, a rotating trellis system that helps to overcome some environmental challenges and also increases yields. So on the single wire, this would be an example of a erect thornless. This grower has using it basically to add stability during heavy fruit set or also during high wind situations. And you can see that's got a very upright or erect growth habit. And he is using some ag lock to help train those canes to that wire. This grower actually also used bob wire instead of smooth high tensile wire, I think mainly because it was what he had available, but he's discovered that it worked really well for him because the canes don't slide a long way up and down the wire. They kind of get hung between the two barbs, so they only have a shorter distance of movement. So that's worked out for him. On the 2-wire T or V trellis, this system basically creates a contained space for the canes to grow up through. It also gives you an opportunity to train or tie canes to each side, and that will open up the middle and improve your harvest time. If you can train your canes to the left and right, maybe you don't have to reach all the way into the middle during harvest. And when I call this a T or a V, you can see in this picture, the bottom wire and the top wire are the same width apart. In the V system, this bottom wire would actually be a little bit narrower, and widen at the top. So you kind of V out, and again, that would give you more exposure in the middle. When you can also and there have been some growers that have used this system. They will train their primicanes to one side, and then train next year's primicanes on the other side, so you alternate harvests on one side of the row or the other. If you train primicanes up on the right side one year, that next year they're going to fruit on that side, and then new primicanes you can train to the other side, and so you're alternating every other year, which could improve your harvest time. And so then we talk about this rotating trellis system. This is kind of a pretty exciting new system. This is allowing you to train primicanes onto a movable or rotating arm. And by having it being able to rotate, the canes could be placed near the ground and covered to offer winter protection. This is going to allow blackberry crops to be more successful in areas where winter damage is frequent. This rotation allows you to put the canes vertical, horizontal, or diagonal with the ground. Now, this is going to take a lot more training management and time commitment, but it can decrease your harvest time by about 30%. So we look at this picture. These are thornless, semi-erect variety. And if you can see, he's got plant space about 6 feet apart with 3 strong canes growing up from each planting spot. And those canes are trained down the row. We're going to go back. And so when he starts this system, he trains the canes up to this bottom wire, which is about 24 inches off the ground. They reach up, and then he's tying them as they continue to grow, this primicane. He's training it along this wire,